Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Revernos. In today's video, we'll be talking about multi-indexes in Python. So a multi-index is when you have more than one column forming the index of your data frame as opposed to a single column. This is a more advanced topic in analysis, but it can be useful if you have hierarchical or nested data or complex data sets that require more precise filters. So I'm going to show you exactly what all of this means and how you can do all of the standard operations that you'll need to know how to do using a multi-index. But first, and we'll go through this in about 30 seconds, first we just have to clean our data. So we'll import pandas using our PD alias. We're going to be looking at house price data today. So as you can see here, we have the zip code, which is called region name, and then we have state name and state. We'll drop this state name column because it's a duplicate. And then we have our city, metro, county name, and a factor, which is really an affordability factor. So we'll drop that state name and we'll rename that to affordability factor. We can take a peek at the columns we have here. And then once we have processed our data set, we can look at the first two rows here. This affordability factor is a ratio of the average price of a single family home in this particular city versus the national average. If you're interested in real estate or housing data, you can download my PropStager app and you can use that to virtually stage a property or analyze real estate deals. But moving on to multi-indexes, the first thing we're going to do is actually create a multi-index using our data. So we have this region name, which is our zip code, and our state columns within our data. And I think those can make a good candidate for a multi-index. So you can use both the state and zip code to reference a particular row within the data set. Setting the multi-index is very easy. We're going to do data equals data, and we'll call the setIndex function. The way we make this a multi-index is we pass in a list instead of a single column name. So we'll pass in state and region name, and then this will allow us to use both state and zip code as an index within our data. And then we can use the head function. We'll just look at the first three rows. You can see this is functioning as intended. We have state and region name, and they're bold because they're serving as indices within our data. And then if we were to look at our index for our data and just look at the unique values and run that, that gives us each unique state and zip code that we have within our data set. The next thing we're going to do is access data in our multi-index, which is fairly simple. We'll use data and we'll use the lock function, and then you'll need your brackets. To actually access data within a multi-index, we're going to use a tuple. So we'll have a set of parentheses here, and we first need to pass in our state, which is the two-letter abbreviations, and we're going to look at a zip code in Texas. We'll look at zip code 79936, and this will tell us that this is the data for El Paso County, and the affordability factor is below 1 here. So this is actually real estate that's cheaper than our national average. I would have to check when this data was last pulled because I know these have been going up in value recently, but that's what we have in our data so far. So the next thing I want to show you is how you can manually create a multi-index, and this requires quite a bit of typing, so I'm just going to copy and paste the code here, and then I'll explain how everything works. But long story short, what we're doing here is we're creating our multi-index using this pandas multi-index from tuples function, and then we're passing in tuples. So these tuples will serve as our indices, and it will be under the city and state columns in our data set. And then we create a data frame that has this additional column, affordability factor, and the index that we pass into our data frame will be this multi-index that we created up here. And then if we take a look at that data frame, we have these two columns serving as our indices, city and state, and then we also have this affordability factor column here. If you want to reset the index and so remove the multi-index and go back to a single column index, that's a fairly simple thing to do. We'll create a new data frame and we'll just call this reset index function, and then we'll take a look at what our data looks like. You can see it removes the multi-index and then just adds these columns back in as regular columns, and then uses a 0 to n-1 index here. If we want to add an additional level to a multi-index, we can do that also, and that's fairly simple. What we're going to do here is add the city column as an index. So we'll take our data and call the setIndex function, and here all we need to do is pass in the column we want to add, and then we'll set this append parameter equal to true. Then if we look at our data, let's look at the first three columns. You can see city is now part of our index when originally it was just an additional column. Sorting a multi-index is a fairly simple thing to do. All you have to do is call the sort index function. Then if you take a peek at your data, you'll see that it's now sorted, and this will be sorted in alphabetical order, and it will be also sorted for each index. So we'll have Alaska, and then the increasing zip codes, and then the name of the increasing cities from A to Z in our data set. You should also note that the sort index function has a lot of different parameters. So you can sort on your rows or your columns. By default, it will sort on the rows, which is what we just did in our example. You can also pass in the level you would like to sort at and whether you want it to ascend or descend when it's sorted. You can also specify if you want to sort in place or not. We set our sorted data frame equal to the value, equal to a new variable. And so we had in place set to false, but if you want to do everything in one line without having to reassign, then you might want to set in place to true. Let's say you have a Pandas data frame that uses a multi-index, but you only want to access a certain slice of that data frame. You can use the cross-section function to do that. So let's say we only want to get Texas data. We can filter our data, and then we'll use .xs. This is the cross-section function. And for key, we're going to pass in the state that we want to filter down to, in this case Texas. And then for level, we're going to pass in the column of the multi-index that we want to filter to. So that would be state in this example. And then we're going to look at our first 3 rows of Texas data. Another thing I want to call out here is you can have this drop level parameter here also that you can set to true or false. It's set to true by default, which is why we don't see that state column that says Texas. But if we were to set this parameter to false, it will preserve that state column, and we'll see that state column that says TX on the left over here. The last thing I'll point out about this cross-section function is you can use this on your index, which is what it does by default, and that's what we did in our example. But you can also apply this to columns, which we won't do in this video, but I want to make you aware that you do have this functionality. We also have the ability to do operations on our multi-index data. So let's say I wanted to look at the affordability factor for each state and just look at the average so I can compare how affordable is one state in comparison to another. I could do a group by, and you have to specify the level. We're going to be looking at the state level here. And we also have to look at the column that we want to take the mean of, which in this case will be affordability factor and the mean. And then this gives us the average affordability factor that we have for each city in our data grouped at the state level. And then you can use this to see, for example, how expensive is one state relative to another. We can also unstack a multi-index, which will take whatever level you specify here and pull that out into columns. So we're doing region name, which is zip code. So each zip code will now become its own column. This really doesn't help us with the particular way that our data is formatted here, because since each zip code is mapped to one state, we're inducing a lot of null values. In fact, the majority of the values here will be null because a zip code can only exist in one state, so we'll create a null for every other state that exists in our data, or every other city, in fact. And so this isn't a useful thing to do with the way our data is formatted, but depending on your data, this might be something you want to do. Another thing I want to talk about is you can re-index a multi-index. I won't type this code, I'll just paste it here. But you can define a new multi-index and then pass in a different number of levels. So in this case, we can have 3 levels, state, region, and full state name. And then you can create a re-index for your data. And then it will re-index. Once again, we're reintroducing null data here. So this is something you want to be careful with. You want to make sure your new index and your old index line up and have the same number of rows. Otherwise, you'll be introducing nulls. But this is something you have the option to do. The last thing I want to show you is how you can drop a level from your multi-index. And to do that, you can take your data and use this drop level function. And let's say we want to drop state. And then look at our first 3 rows. You can see now we have our region or zip code and our city data, but the state index is now gone. That's everything I wanted to show you with multi-indexes. Once again, this isn't going to be something you use every day because it only really makes sense if you have nested or hierarchical data. But if you do encounter that use case, it's a very useful thing to have in your toolbox. So I wanted to thank you all for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Subscribe to Avernos. We'll have a lot of great content coming about Python, data analysis, and iOS app development coming in the near future. So make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.